all you do is put some casters in the cup, as many as you think you need, and simply clip it on the end of the pole. It's worth mentioning there that I've got a small piece of rubber fitted on the pole, and that enables me to clip the cup on and it won't spin. Very often with a cup it will spin on the pole, but if you put a small piece of rubber on, when you clip it on, that will not tip on the pole, and therefore when you cut the casters out or grain bait or anything else, you can ensure you get it in the right place and it doesn't spill out halfway out because it's too heavy and the cup turns over. You need to be a bit careful when it's like this because the wind's picking up and it's starting to blow at me and it's getting a bit rough, so ship it out carefully to ensure that you don't spill it anywhere else, and then simply tip it up and put it in the swim. So I'll put a few casters there. I'm just going to keep my eye on that for 5 minutes, and if I see any fish blowing I'm going to go across and have a go for them. When I go across and fish with the tench, I'm going to use a much heavier rig because the tench in here grow to 4 or 5 pounds. Just moving the pole around the bank because there's a cyclist coming. He did ring his bell, so no danger of a broken pole. I think it's worth using a pole roller on these sort of venues because at least it keeps the pole up off the ground a foot or two, and hopefully the cyclist can see it. I've shipped it across the far bank, so I just need to take those sections of pole off and lay them down the bank, and then I'm back fishing down the middle on the hemp again. And in fact I've just seen some bubbles coming up on the far bank there now, so I'll give this a few minutes and then I'm going to go across and see if I can catch a tench. We've got another pole set up for tench fishing. Just put the hook in the bottom of the butt there, and then that keeps that tidy and out of the way while we lie it on the bank. Pick up a different rig. Now this rig I'm using is much heavier line. It's a 2.5 pound line, which is about a 0.12 diameter line, which is about 2.5 pound breaking strain line. And when I make these rigs up for tench fishing, I don't actually use any hook length at all. I've got one length of line direct from the pole tip straight to the hook, and by avoiding the use of any knots you end up with a stronger rig which is unlikely to break. The float is worth a mention. The float is a simple piece of peacock quill with a nylon bristle in the bottom. I prefer these sort because being peacock it's fairly buoyant and it's ideal for putting bigger baits on the bottom. It won't constantly drag under. And also because the bristle in the bottom is nylon, they're very durable and they don't tend to break, whereas with a lot of floats when you're using them for carp and tench fishing they end up tangling up and breaking up, and you can use quite a lot of floats in one session. So I've seen some bubbles, there's some bubbles coming up there now, so I'm going to go across with this heavier rig. I'm going to put 2 casters on the hook because I've been feeding some casters and grain bait over there, and just simply hook 2 fairly dark casters onto the hook. Pick up the stronger pole. Now I've got a pole here rigged up with 10 elastic because if we hook a tench in those lilies then we want to give ourselves a fighting chance of getting it out, so it would be pointless going across with a lighter rig. We may get more bites. It would be pointless going across on a lighter rig you may actually get more bites. In fact, I'm sure you would get more bites on a lighter rig, but if you hook one on a lighter rig you're sure to lose it. So I'm using a 10 elastic and a much heavier line, and hopefully if you hook one it's going to come out. Now this length of the canal where I'm fishing, I've chosen this particular peg because we've got some lilies down the far bank, and although the canal is deep there aren't lilies growing all the way along the far bank. In fact, the pegs to my right there's very few lilies, so what it means here is I can place the bait right in amongst the lilies and it's a natural holding spot. There we go, there's a float on. I actually had a bite then on 2 casters, and look at that, would you believe it? 2 casters on a heavier line, and there's another roach. Exactly the same size as we were catching on the hemp. Let's put him in the net. There are obviously a lot of roach feeding today, so if we continue catching roach on double casters, then the next step would actually to put a bigger bait on and put on something like double worm, or even a large piece of bread, or even some sweet corn, something that the roach aren't going to eat immediately. By doing that it gives you a chance of actually avoiding the small fish, giving the tench or the bream that are in here a chance to pick the bait up. And drop the bait there right alongside the lilies. It's always quite exciting when it goes under when you're fishing against the lilies, because you're always expecting a tench, but as you saw the last time, it doesn't always work out like that. Now the float's going again now, it's gone again. Now we're getting pestered with the attentions of lots of little roach there, so what I'm going to do is just slip a worm on and see if that will sort the tench out. With all these baits, worms, hemp, anything else, it's important to pick out, put on a size of bait that the fish are going to like. And when I'm fishing with worms, I tend to use a worm about the size of a matchstick. You can put bigger worms on, and obviously fish will eat the bigger worms, but I prefer to put on 2 small worms, pick up another one, just like a matchstick, that sort of size, and that's going to be a nice bait for any bream or tench. Hook them on about 1/4 of the way along, and what I actually do with one of the worms is just nip the head off, and that releases a bit of the fluid from inside the worm, makes it wriggle a bit as well, releases a bit of fluid from inside the worm, may help the fish find it quicker. So we're going to just drop in now with 2 worms on the hook, and drop it right alongside the lilies. There we are, right next to the lilies. And usually when you put bait across the far bank and you can see fish blowing, you would normally expect a bite within a few minutes. I mean, the tench are there because I've seen them blowing, so if they're going to feed you should catch one fairly quickly. So give it 5 or 10 minutes, and if you're not catching you can always go back on the hemp or fish in another part of the swim and catch a few fish. Very important not to forget whilst you're fishing over the far side. Yeah, I'm getting some attention, some fish there now. Yeah, that fish has come off, and that was a tiny fish on 2 worms. There are obviously so many fish prepared to feed in this canal. What I would do is put a slightly bigger worm on. Just nip the head off, put on a caster, when I put a caster on the hook, I tend to pick out the darker casters, because the darker the caster, the more buoyant they are, and in fact when they go black they float completely. But by picking out a darker one and putting it on the hook, because it's slightly more buoyant, it makes the bait behave more naturally. So we've got a worm and a caster on there, just drop it back in again, and hopefully we can avoid the attentions of these little roach. Hopefully hook a bigger fish. Whilst you're doing this, it's obviously important not to forget to feed the hemp swim, so just keep flicking a few grains or throwing a few grains of hemp in every now and again, and then when you go back down the middle there's going to be some more fish ready and waiting to be caught. Now looking at that, I believe there's again small fish, still small fish pulling at that. Look at that, that worm's been bitten completely in half, probably by a small rudd. Unfortunately there will be days when it will be just impossible to avoid the attentions of these fish. What's actually interesting is when the tench and bream turn up, they're very aggressive feeders and they will usually push the small roach out anyway, so very often a good sign, just put the caster on, nip the head off again. Very often a good sign when you do this, strangely, is that you go across and you don't actually get a bite immediately. What that means is that the small fish have disappeared, and it's very likely that there are some bigger fish in the swim. So let's have one more go and see if we can avoid some small fish and catch a tench. Dropping it right in amongst the lilies. The beauty of pole fishing, as opposed to fishing with a rod and a reel against the far bank of canals like this, is that if you should hook a tench and it goes in the lilies, you can actually pull directly upwards, and it gives you far more chance of getting the tench out of the swim, whereas on a rod and a reel you can only pull in one direction. And very often when you hook a tench on a rod and you strike, the fish immediately wants to pull in the opposite direction and it swims straight into the far bank. And when that happens, there's not actually much you can do. So I've just had another bite there on a worm and a caster, and again it's a very small roach. Would you believe it? Sometimes it's very difficult to avoid the attentions of these little fish. Try once more with a bigger worm. I'm going to put two bigger worms on and not put the caster on this time. Have one more go and see if we can put one. Pick some worms out and hook them about a quarter of the way down. Nip the head off. And away we go again. The weather's starting to brighten up slightly, but it's still fairly overcast, and it should actually be, it's a perfect day for fishing. And there must be some bigger fish prepared to feed. Very often on canals such as this, where the water is not particularly coloured, on very bright days the fish don't tend to feed during the day, they just feed very early and very late. So if you want to catch one, it's best to make an early start and get on the bank about 5 or 6 o'clock. And sometimes you get a feeding period up till 9 or 10 o'clock, and then when the sun goes up in the sky, the fish stop feeding and then have another spell just before it gets dark at night. So by turning up and fishing for a couple of hours in the morning, a couple of hours in the evening, you can probably catch more than you would if you fished all day. Now that's interesting. I've dropped in with two bigger worms, and nothing's happened, so it could be that there are a few tench here now, hopefully. Keep my fingers crossed. It may actually go under. I've just seen one or two of the lilies move slightly. There are also a few carp along this section of the canal, but they're very rarely hooked. But they certainly make the presence known when they're in the far bank in the lilies. Bear in mind that a large carp is sort of the size of a small dog, and when it's swimming around in the lilies it's certainly going to move them, and they'll be all too visible. The difficult thing is just getting them out if you actually hook them. So I'll just give that a few minutes now that we're not getting any bites from small fish. Just give it a few minutes and see what happens. Bridgwater Canal is a very good canal for specimen fish. It was originally used, it was dug in about 1820, and it was used as an industrial canal, and it linked the River Tone in Taunton with the docks in Bridgwater, and there was a lot of boat traffic on it. But these days obviously there's no industrial boats, and you get very few pleasure craft on this canal because it's not linked with other canals around the country. In some areas like the Midlands you can get on a boat and go for hundreds of miles along the canal, but this one just goes 9 miles from Bridgwater to Taunton. And that's as far as you can go, so as a consequence, apart from the odd boat at the weekend, you get very little boat traffic. Therefore you get very little movement from the water when people are opening and closing locks.